So the different ways that we do pen testing will depend on the methodology that you decide to utilize. And there are several standards out there. And I wanted to cover some of these just so that you know that there's not just one solution. In fact, there's oodles and oodles. Let's first start with the OSSTMM, which is short for the Open Source Security Testing Methodology Manual. Now, this standard was actually compiled by a gentleman by the name of Pete Herzog, and it's a standard set of penetration tests to, or at least the attempt to achieve, a high security matrix. It is considered to be the de facto standard for some of the highest level of testing. There's also OWASP. This is short for Open Web Application Security Project, which is, again, an open source methodology. There's several tools that they help to utilize, as well as a knowledge base, as well as a interesting little tool that is called the ZAP, or the Z-Attack Proxy Project. This is a tool that can actually automatically help you find vulnerabilities in web applications. It's designed more for web developers, but obviously pen testers can use this tool as well. There's also the ISSFA, which is the Information System Security Assessment Framework. This is also an open source project on how to conduct a pen test. It is actually supported by a special group called the Open Information System Security Group. Another standard that you could look at is the NIST, which, yes, lots of acronyms here, stands for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And again, they have also a nice little website. This is actually a federal technology agency that goes through and works with the industry to develop and apply technologies, measurements, and standards. Then we have LPT, which is EC Council's Licensed Penetration Tester. Now this one is actually a proprietary methodology, as well as we've got one from McAfee, which is called Foundstone. And also we have ISS, which is done by IBM. In the case of IBM, they actually do their own testing for you. Now in the case of IBM, they discontinued the signature product, which was a product called the Proventia Multifunction Security Appliance, and now offers several different services to help secure or to test your network environment. The same thing with McAfee and Foundstone, or technically at the time of this recording, it's actually owned by Intel. Who knows who owns Intel in the future, or this particular product, right? Now with EC Council's LPT, that's not a connection for your printer. Well, it is, just a different meaning of the acronym. Again, this is a licensed penetration tester. This requires the tester to go through several different steps, very similar to the CEH. You have to go through a course. You then have to go through an application process, which includes a $900 fee, in which case they're given access to EC Council's Aspen environment, where basically they go through and do a pen test against a test environment. And they have 30 days to go through and submit the report to EC Council. Now with each of these, whether it's the open source or the proprietary versions of these methodologies, all of them are very similar. Now, each one of these methodologies will actually help you in making sure that you cover all your bases. They typically all start off with an information gathering stage, which we've talked already. It's about going out and finding out as much information as we can about the target company, whether that's from public sources, newspapers, internet articles, blogs, third-party information sources. We then typically go through an external pen test. Again, we're looking for vulnerabilities that are accessible from the outside. Obviously, then we would look at a vulnerability analysis so we can find weak points based off of software, operating systems, or devices. After that, we would go through and do an internal network penetration test to see what type of information is exposed from the inside. We then go through the firewall pen testing. This is typically your primary line of defense from the outside world, but you'd also want to do testing from the DMZ. We then want to make sure that, again, and we've talked about this already, but the methodologies will help us to verify that the IDS is doing what it's supposed to do, that is, detect intrusions. But as a pen tester, we're going to be looking to see if there's any vulnerabilities that would allow the attacker to get around the settings of the alarms that are configured on these systems. Password cracking techniques can then be used to identify vulnerabilities associated with password management. This helps you to make sure that you're not prone to things like brute force attacks or hybrid attacks or dictionary attacks. And again, if you're not familiar with some of these concepts, I'm going to hit this over and over through this course, folks. You've got to go back and watch the previous courses on each of these domains. These methodologies also make sure that you cover the social engineering pen tests. Now, these types of tests can be done by either using human-based techniques or, believe it or not, social engineering with computers, getting someone to open up an email attachment. We'll also cover ourselves by looking at web application pen tests. We're going to be looking for code-related or back-end vulnerabilities. Probably some of the more famous tests would include our SQL pen test. SQL injection is so common today. It takes advantage of non-validated input variables that get passed on via SQL commands through the web application that actually execute on the back-end database. Now, depending on where you put your routers within your network and, of course, switches, they actually forward data packets from point to point, sometimes inside and sometimes outside your network. Take down the router and you end up taking out everybody that's connected to the router. When you're pen testing routers, you should actually do it from the internet as well as from the inside. We'll also look at the wireless network. Typically, we're going to focus in on the availability of outside wireless networks that can be accessed by employees of the company. This technically circumvents the company's firewall. Because wireless can't be restrained, it goes out everywhere in the air and we don't see it. The signal can actually be accessible from outside the physical confines of the company's location. We'll also be obviously looking at the strength of the encryption as well as the type of encryption being deployed. We'll also continue to cover our bases with these methodologies by doing a denial of service test. See if we can bring down the enterprise network or an e-commerce site by flooding it with packets or so much traffic that it doesn't know what to do anymore. When we're doing a denial of service attack, what we're actually looking for is what is the threshold where the system starts to have a heart attack. Here's one you may not have thought of, and that's why these methodologies are here, is how do we handle stolen devices? You know, that's great. You've gone through and you've locked down all your phones and laptops, but what happens when those devices get stolen? In this case here, a pen testing team will try to actually steal mobile equipment and then conduct some tests that are offline to gain access to the information that's stored on those devices. Now, typically, I'm not going to go after someone's device that's in the sales department. I might actually try to focus my attack towards somebody that I've identified as being in the IT department or someone in senior management that's going to have a little more permission or access. Oh, and heaven forbid I get a hold of a CTO or chief technology officer's device and insert your evil laugh there. We'll also want to look at source code penetration tests. So many companies today are using applications that are created in-house, and sometimes these applications aren't even considered as part of the security platform. So as a pen tester, you're going to look at the source code either manually or there's several tools out there that could help you with that. Zap being one of them. One of my favorites, and cue the Mission Impossible theme song, is the physical security pen test. That's where I drop down through the ventilation shaft, suspended on the steel cable, so I can steal the knock list. No, you're not buying me suspended by a cable? In this type of testing, the testing team will attempt to gain access to the facilities before, during, and after business hours. Now, we typically don't do destructive things. For example, we don't break windows. But if I come up on a chain link fence that's locked, if I can't pick the lock, I'm just going to disassemble the gate. Now, some companies are a little scared about that type of test being done. So another thing you can do is actually do walkthroughs to provide the company with an objective perspective of their security controls that are currently in place and how they could be bypassed. But the other way is so much more fun. Does the company have cameras? If so, we need to understand, do they have a web interface? What is their viewing angles? Yes, I've justified a reason for buying a drone. Think about that one for a second. I actually saw this on a video and I went, how cool is that? I can use a drone to fly into an area, to look at the top of the camera, to look behind the camera without being detected. So again, I'm going to be looking for things like how much motion is allowed before the camera kicks in, or again, where is the visibility of the camera? That's also another fun pen test. We'll also want to make sure that we look at our database pen tests. This is where we're going to try to directly access data contained in the database by trying to use some password cracking techniques that we've learned about in previous courses. Or maybe by trying to do our standard SQL injection attack. But not all of the databases are SQL based. Now, I've told you throughout this series, and I think Troy has warned you as well, is that systems that are open for vulnerabilities are systems that haven't been updated or patched. So that's something we want to check. We'll also want to look at something called data leakage. Now, what we mean by here is we want to see if data that consists of things like intellectual property, private or sensitive data, kind of what we hear today about breaches or data breaches. So this particular pen test should try to help to do things like prevent confidential information from going out into the market or to your competitors. Who has access to these files? You should also be trying to improve the awareness among your employees on some best practices. Now, this would be more targeted, but if the company is using a SAP platform, you may want to implement a pen test against it to see again if it's been patched correctly, if there's any vulnerabilities that an attacker could use, since SAP typically has a lot of business critical information within it. Another area to take a look at when pen testing would be your VPN pen test. Most companies today allow some of their employees to work remotely, either if they're on the road, like a road warrior, or working from home. In either case, VPNs actually create a trusted connection to the internal network. Knowing that, the pen tester will attempt to gain access to the VPN, either by trying to compromise a remote endpoint or trying to gain access to the VPN tunnel so that they can gain access into the network. Here's one you may not have thought of. How many of you guys are using VoIP? It's on a network, isn't it? I'm actually surprised how many companies have it on the same network. Typically, they're smaller companies, but I've seen it. Makes me scratch my head. But what we attempt to do here is just trying to gain access to the VoIP network for the purpose of trying to record conversations or possibly do a denial of service so that they can't communicate. Another popular feature is the cloud, right? So when you start using the cloud, security is based off a shared responsibility of both the provider and the client. And there are many security risks associated to cloud computing. Other tests that you'd want to accomplish would include, obviously, virtual machines. Everyone's using virtualization, right? Just because the host machine is fully patched doesn't mean the VM is. Or typically what we find is that the virtual machine is patched, but the host isn't. And because the virtual environment is an exact duplication of the physical environment, it suffers the same security concerns that we have. If the VM is running software or applications, guess what? It's vulnerable. The attacker doesn't care if it's virtual or not. It's just another target. Anybody have any modems out there still? Well, it's not necessarily just modems because some folks are still even using analog phone systems. When we do these types of tests, we're looking to see if we're able to obviously get in through a older technology that maybe a company has forgotten about. I've mentioned before in some of my other courses that I had a student whose network got totally pwned because they forgot they had the modem bank up still. Somebody got in, even though nobody was using it, but somebody war dialed it, found it, was able to get in through that connection and create a new account for themselves. And then they were able to get in through the internet itself, having created the account. So we want to see if, modems are still holding their default passwords. If the modems are identifying themselves via a banner. Well, what about malware pen testing? This is like haunting us nowadays. Whether it's a Trojan or a virus or ransomware. I mean, Trojans designed to go through and do malicious things like steal sensitive information, delete the information, replace operating system files, maybe even perform a denial of service attack or start watching what you're doing with keyloggers or create backdoors or even give me remote access. We know what viruses are designed to do: destroy data, slow systems down, consume a ton of resources. And of course, as I mentioned before, we also have the issue with ransomware. So as penetration testers, we need to go through and make sure that we look for any ports that may be suspicious that are open. Also look for any processes or registry entries, or believe it or not, yes, I've talked to you guys about this before in my other courses, device drivers that are infected, Windows services, fake services, what programs have network access. How do users or employees handle malware or ransomware coming in through email? Well, here's another thing that you need to consider when you're doing your pen testing, and that is looking at log management. Log files record the who, what, where, when of everything on the network, right? So managing those log files, making sure that they're put in locations that are a little bit more secure or properly secured, or monitoring them for any modifications. My favorite still to this day is people who say, yeah, we have log files. We don't go back and look at them until after the fact. Really? After the fact is too late. We should also be testing for their file integrity checking. How are they handling that? Here we're making sure that no files are being tampered with, especially when it comes to operating system files. That kind of goes back to the malware stuff. But we should be trying to identify things like who modified the file, what are the attributes, how are those recorded and maintained. Yeah, this is going to be a whole new one right here too. Mobile devices. This is huge. Everyone's going mobile. Everybody wants to be mobile. And heaven forbid you're doing BYOD. Now you have to start monitoring and checking out people's personal systems. And because these mobile devices operate different OSs and different applications, it actually introduces new security issues for us. Technically, I think there should be one person monitoring mobile devices at all time. We talked about VoIP, but we also have telecom and broadband penetration testing. My favorite is doing medium and small businesses where their internet connection is their little router in their office. But I always ask them the question, where does the line come from? Yeah, it comes from that little wiring closet for the building. Well, who's monitoring that? Who's managing that? Could somebody place something in there to start capturing everything that's going on within that building? It doesn't matter which business in that building I'm looking at. I can gather everybody. We talked about malware. One of the biggest ways that people get in with malware and ransomware is email. So we should be obviously looking at email security. This is probably the most used type of communication in the world today. Unless you ask my teenage kids, they'll tell you it's text messaging. But it's because we're using email to store personal information and corporate data with attachments. If I'm able to get a hold of one account, like, the CEO's account, I don't think it doesn't happen. Anybody remember the FBI director's email account being hacked? And it can be done from either internal or external folks. It could be a huge impact on the company. Again, this should be looked at from both internal and external. And of course, you need to make sure that you do a Batcave pen test because, only I have a Batcave. Whoops, I mean my own network. Because I'm really not Batman, I'm just Dale.